The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki equated to explosions of 15 kilotons of TNT. This blast released radioactive gases into the atmosphere. But an accident that later released 400 times more gases resulted in a very large dome that can be seen there today, 354 feet high and 840 feet wide. This dome covers up the historic disaster that even shook the Soviet Union, America's greatest enemy, into panic. This explosion is known as the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, where a tiny mistake astonishingly caused the equivalent of 225 tons of TNT. The Chernobyl nuclear plant was located in the now abandoned city of Pripyat, 100 kilometers from Ukraine's capital Kyiv, and today it lies completely deserted. At that time, Ukraine was also part of the Soviet Union, as you all know. It was the era of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union had started using nuclear energy to build many power plants, one of which was called Nobel. This power plant consisted of 4 nuclear reactors, named 1, 2, 3, and 4. Reactor number 4 was the last one built, and today a huge dome stands over it. Each of these 4 reactors had the capacity to produce 1,000 megawatts of electricity, which at the time met nearly half of the Soviet Union's electricity demand. In simple terms, to understand how these reactors worked, nuclear reactions were used to heat water. That water turned into steam and drove turbines, and the spinning turbines generated electricity. But because a nuclear reaction is a chain reaction, once started it cannot be controlled easily. Each reactor contained 211 control rods to control the nuclear reaction. These control rods were made of a material that absorbed the neutrons released during the nuclear reaction, because it is the neutrons that collide with uranium atoms and sustain the nuclear reaction. When the neutrons stick to the control rods instead of uranium, the nuclear reaction naturally slows down. In Chernobyl's case, these control rods were made of boron carbide, while their tips were graphite. Remember that this process ran continuously, reaching temperatures of 1,600 degrees Celsius inside the reactor, which is about 30% of the temperature on the sun's surface. And therefore, cooling the reactor was extremely important. For this purpose, water circuits ran inside the reactor. This water circulated constantly with the help of pumps, just like coolant is used to keep a car engine cool. Here, in Chernobyl's reactors, there was a design flaw that perhaps no one had imagined. In cars, the water rotation stops when the engine is turned off. But in a nuclear reactor, the water must not stop rotating even for a single second, because even after the reaction is stopped, it continues to produce heat for a long time. Therefore, it was essential that the water pumps run continuously without interruption. Of course, electricity was needed to run these water pumps. This electricity was normally supplied by the reactor's own turbines, and in case of a power failure, special backup diesel generators were also installed. But the problem was that when switching to the diesel generators, the water pumps would be off for up to 60 seconds. Engineers wanted these pumps to keep running even during those 60 seconds, so a safety system was installed. This system ensured that when the reactor was shut down, it would not immediately stop producing electricity. The 1,000 megawatts of production would decline slowly, and during that time, the remaining electricity would keep the pumps running for 60 seconds, after which the backup generators would start. The system had been installed, but its testing was still pending, which was a mandatory process. The testing for Reactor 4 remained to be done, while Reactors 1, 2, and 3 had already been successfully tested. It was the evening of April 25, 1986, and preparations were underway to perform this safety test on Reactor 4 under the supervision of Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. The previous 2 attempts to perform this test on Reactor 4 had failed. It is said that the Deputy Chief Engineer was determined to complete the test that night at all costs. According to the rulebook, the test should be performed when the reactor was producing 700 megawatts of power, but normally it produced 1,000 megawatts. The Deputy Chief Engineer ordered control rods to be inserted to slow the reactor, and the nuclear reaction began to slow down. Everything was going normally until the control rods were perhaps inserted too far, which caused the reactor's power to drop directly from 1,000 down to 30 megawatts. To raise the reactor's power again, some control rods were withdrawn slightly, and the power rose from 30 to 200 megawatts. To increase the power further, a few more control rods were withdrawn. Now out of the total 211 control rods, only 8 remained inside the reactor. a violation of the rulebook. The rulebook specified that fewer than 15 control rods should never be inside the reactor. Because of this violation, the reaction accelerated rapidly, and the power climbed from 200 to several thousand megawatts, far exceeding 1,000 megawatts. Due to such extreme heat, the water in the pipes began to evaporate rapidly, and that water actually helped cool the reactor core. At that moment, panic spread in the control room, and the entire reactor began to vibrate violently. There was only one solution to control this. Press the emergency shutdown button so that all control rods would be inserted into the reactor and stop the nuclear reaction. And the engineers did precisely that. They immediately pressed the emergency shutdown button, but as the control rods moved in, the reactor exploded with a tremendous blast. The intensity of this explosion was recorded as equivalent to 225 tons of TNT. For comparison, let me tell you that the radioactive gases released into the atmosphere by the nuclear bomb, Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima, were 400 times less than the gases released by this disaster. At that time, it was the night between April 26 and 27, 1986. Here the question arises. Control rods were supposed to slow the reaction, so why did they increase the reaction? In fact, this explosion happened because of the graphite on the tips of the control rods. As you learned earlier, the control rods were made of boron carbide, and their tips of graphite. Boron carbide can stop a nuclear reaction, but graphite further increases it. Just before pressing the emergency shutdown button, the reaction was already beyond its limits, and when the graphite-tipped rods entered, the reaction surged. The reactor walls exceeded their tolerance and it ruptured. 2 engineers were killed on the spot, and 2 others were badly burned. The explosion caused a fire in the plant's reactor area, which was initially considered an ordinary fire because no one knew that radioactive material, equal to 5 petabecquerels, had been released into the atmosphere due to the blast. Firefighters arrived on site and tried to extinguish the blaze with water. But this fire could not be put out because it was not an ordinary fire, but a graphite fire, which is not easy to extinguish. Immediately after the accident, the entire city of Pripyat, which had about 50,000 residents at the time, was evacuated overnight. The Soviet Union declared an emergency and arranged hundreds of buses to take the city's people far to the Slovenian city. In Pripyat, the work of extinguishing the fire continued for the next 10 days. More than 5,000 tons of sand, earth, and other materials were dropped by helicopters in an attempt to control the fire. Finally, after 10 days, the fire was brought under control. But for many more days, continuous radioactive gases kept leaking into the atmosphere. Firefighters who were fighting the blaze fell ill due to radioactive gases, and some people died in the following days and months. At first, the Soviet Union wanted to suppress the news because it was the Cold War era, and this news could severely damage the Soviet Union's image. But the secret could not be hidden for long. About 36 hours after the explosion, on April 28th, a Swedish radiation monitoring station observed rising radiation levels in the air and traced the radiation back to Ukraine. Consequently, the Soviet government had to reveal the matter to the world. Even after the fire at Reactor 4 was extinguished, the danger was not completely over. Under the reactor, there was a pool of water that had been contaminated with a large amount of radioactive material. If it was not emptied in time, the steam from this water could release even more radioactive gases into the air. The only way to empty it was for someone to jump in and open its drain valve at the bottom. But going into this radioactive water was tantamount to risking one's life, and no one agreed to do it. 3 heroes, actually superheroes, appeared. Mechanical engineer Alexei Ananenko, senior engineer Leonid Toptunov, and shift supervisor Boris Baronov. They risked their lives to save others and decided to perform the task. The 3 descended into that pool, swam in the dark to the drain, opened it, and emptied the water, thus stopping the reaction. Many called their mission a suicide mission, but fortunately the 3 emerged safely, though by then much damage had already been done. As a result of the explosion, iodine-131 and other dangerous chemicals spread into the air, causing thousands to develop thyroid cancer and killing several thousand people over time. Most of those affected were firefighters and those involved in the later Chernobyl cleanup operations. These chemicals wreaked havoc across Europe. Forests where radioactive waste fell turned from green to red, and with rainfall the contaminants spread into grasslands. harming animals that ate the contaminated grass. In the first 4 months after the accident, only 31 people died. But due to the radiation released, nearly 4,000 people lost their lives over the following few years. This figure is only an estimate. In reality, it is very difficult to determine how many lives were truly lost. Because of it, today the Chernobyl disaster site is not open to the general public because even 38 years later, some radiation still leaks out. And this radiation will continue to cause harm for the next 400 years. To prevent these radiations from spreading into the atmosphere, the government installed a very large dome, which cost about $3 billion to construct, and will prevent Chernobyl disaster radiation from spreading into the atmosphere for the next 100 years. We hope you will like and share this video. Thank you very much for your loving comments, and see you in the next great video.